Hello everyone, welcome to our Truth Be Told YouTube channel with your hosts Rick Howard and Mike Maney.
Hello everyone, welcome out to another fun-filled session with a couple of guys who try to be serious, but every once in a while we act like we're teenage boys again.
Yes, we do.
Silly jokes.
Yes.
But we mostly stay on track. Every once in a while we have to chase a rabbit, shoot a squirrel, and all those kind of things.
Right. Yep. Yep.
So how you doing, Mike?
I'm doing great.
You just told me before we came on, because we have to satisfy our good buddy Braden. You just told me before we came on, it's 69 and rainy.
Yes.
So we're entering the last half of August. And is that kind of normal? You start getting a little bit of fall time weather?
Yeah, the latter rains, as the Bible calls it. Yeah. So I just hope it doesn't turn cold, and then we just kind of miss out on the rest of the fall. I love the fall. I love the smell of the rotting leaves on the ground, and just that crisp air in the morning, and then it warms up to say 70s.
Well, I'm looking at your 10-day forecast, and it's going to be in the mid 80s for like the next week. Next Tuesday says 91.
91.
And then it drops down into the mid 70s. So it looks like you'll get a little spurt of heat for a day or two, and then it'll drop back down.
Yeah.
As it slowly works its way into fall time weather.
Yeah.
We've been hot, but we had a few days that cooled off. We caught the little remnants of Tropical Storm Hillary that slammed into Southern California and caused a lot of flooding and a lot of lightning and thunder and all over the Sierra Mountains, and kind of scattered all over California, but especially the southern half, out there in the desert, Palm Springs and out in there in Lancaster, the high desert. You just have these little gullies. And it doesn't take much rain to just turn into like a raging river.
Yeah.
A lot of times it floods the roads with not just water, but mud.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had my 50th anniversary of the ministry here at Liberty this last Saturday. We had a big crowd and a lot of people we've served with and love and care for a lot of years. It was just a great weekend. And but I made a smart remark of those who left Saturday afternoon to head back to Southern California. Quite a few of them had to be home for church on Sunday. But I made a smart remark about them on Sunday here for those who had stayed, that the people who left had heard that Hillary was paying a visit to Southern California, and they were anxious to go visit Hillary. That's one of those corny jokes we make. Right.
My thought was, no sooner had Philip announced that he was moving to Southern California that the devil was cooking up a storm.
We try our best, don't we, to get chuckle. We usually get a few people will chuckle, but at least our wives usually just roll their eyes.
They do, yes. That's what they're good at.
Another poor attempt by my husband of humor.
They love us. They love us for it.
In spite of it.
Yes.
In spite of it. So we're going to stay looks like we're going to stay in the low to mid 90s for the next 10 days. So that'll get us about through Labor Day, and it'll still be hot. But I would think in September we start seeing some days down in the 80s, maybe even just the high 70s. We look forward to those few days. It can stay hot through October, but it slowly gives up its grip. Yours gives up its grip much more dramatically. Ours is gradual.
Yes. Yeah.
But anyway, today is August the 23rd, 2023.
Mm-hmm.
And this is session number 80.
Hooray! Session number 80.
80. So we are marching toward 100 sessions. And by now we have given our good brethren lots of evidence to be used against us.
Yes, we have. Yes.
If they want to pick and choose and then piece together different statements we've made, it can make us sound like we believe anything.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what the news media does these days. They'll piece different little remarks and make it sound like the person's saying the opposite of what they're trying to say.
Little sound bites, they call them. Yeah.
Sound bites. Sound
Yeah.
bites can bite, can't they?
Yes, they can. Yes. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we are not as careful as some about how we phrase things and say things. So I would think it'd be fairly easy for someone to put a bunch of sound bites together that make us sound like we don't know what we're talking about.
Hey, at our age, we're just going to throw it out there, brother.
At our age, you can't do us much more harm than already.
Can't do us any harm.
We have so many bite marks on our body by now. One more is not going to hurt.
That's right. Oh, that's right.
So last session, we said we were going to try to get into the book of Numbers. We're going through the Pentateuch, the Tanakh, the Torah, first 5 books of the Bible, written by Moses. And we've spent quite a bit of time in the first 3 books. We're going to move more quickly through Numbers and Deuteronomy because they cover similar themes that we've already dealt with. But the book of Numbers, we don't want to rush through too quick. We might just cover it in one lesson, but if it takes 2 or 3, so be it, because there is some really good information stories in the book of Numbers. And our English Bibles call it Numbers because it starts and ends with the census of the people. And that one census is in chapter 1, verse 2, where God told Moses to take a census, especially in verse 3, from 20 years older. And so he did that. And then in chapter 26, verse 2, the Lord told him again to take a census. So that's why we get the book of Numbers. The Jewish Bible calls it a little differently. They take that little phrase in the first verse of chapter 1, in the wilderness. That's actually more accurate because Exodus and Leviticus. So Exodus just, of course, covers the Exodus and their time at Mount Sinai, so it doesn't go beyond the first year out of Egypt. And then Leviticus, of course, dealing with all of their different laws of offerings and priesthood and just a lot of their different laws. So it's not until of course, Deuteronomy is at the end of the 40 years where Moses is recounting their 40 years looking back. So Numbers is really the only book of these that deals with the overall look at the 40 years. So their time in the wilderness is how the Jewish Bibles call it. And it doesn't give all the details, but it more than any of the other books, it gives more of an overview of those 40 years. And but even then, the first half of Numbers is still dealing with the second year. The first year is in the book of Exodus. And we notice in chapter 1, verse 1 of Numbers, says, on the first day of the second month, in the second year after they came out of the land of Egypt. So they stayed at Mount Sinai. If you look at Exodus 19:1, they got to Sinai in about two months or so, month and a half, a little bit more. It says in the 3rd month, but the first month, the Passover was halfway through the month, so there's only 15 days in that first month. Then you got the second month of 30 days, so that's 45. And then it was in the first part of the 3rd month. And then it speaks about the 3rd day in that chapter. And so that's the reason why most people believe that they arrived at Sinai and Moses went up the mountain for the first time to receive the 10 Commandments on Pentecost. That'd be 50 days after the time of Passover, after the waving of the first fruit. And so I don't doubt that. I think Exodus 19 is dealing with what we call the time of Pentecost. That would be very fitting for him to go up and receive the law at that time. And then he went up and down a number of times after that. And so they stayed in Sinai for about a year. And we know that from the first verse that it's the first day of the second month in the second year. So it's just short of a full year, just a few days short of a full year. And then in chapter 10 of Numbers, in verse 11, now it came to pass on the 20th day, so 10 days had passed, or the 20 days had passed, because 1/1 is the first day of the second month of the second year. And 10/11 is the 20th day of the second month in the second year, so 20 days later, the cloud was taken up. In verse 13, they started out for the first time. So they leave Sinai just barely shy of a full year. And so now they're in the second year out of Egypt. And yet in chapter 13 and 14 and 15, when the 12 spies went in to spy out the land, that was still in the second year. So we're halfway through this book and we're still not 2 years out of Egypt, because of course the 40 days the spies were in the land and brought back the evil report, at least 10 of them. That's why God had them wander in the wilderness for 38 more years, for a total of 40 years. And so the rest of the book of Numbers from chapter 16 on, 15 on, is the last part of that period of 38 years, the next 38 years into the book of Deuteronomy, where they're toward the end of the 40 years. So, and a lot of the second half of Numbers is dealing with reminder of the different laws and offerings and priesthood and the settlement of the tribes. So we're not given a whole lot of details of that last 38 years, but enough to let us know God was still with them, leading them by the pillar, cloud by day and fire by night, to give them shade and warmth, light in darkness and shade. They're out in the middle of the desert. So you would welcome a huge cloud over you to block the heat of the sun.
Yes.
So it's more than just about leading them, although that was the main purpose of the cloud, pillar of cloud and fire. But it was also a very practical benefit to give them light in a extremely dark wilderness desert area, and also to give them a certain amount of shade in the heat of the sun. So God often has multiple levels of purposes for what he does. Some of them very large and dramatic, like the leadership idea. Whenever it would stop, they would stop. Whenever it went, they would go. So that large idea, but then the practical benefit of the light and the shade. So, and probably other benefits that we're unaware of. The times that they camped, they would be able to be active much more than they would be if it was in the full heat of the sun. So, just, things we don't normally think about. God was blessing them like he does us, blesses us in ways we're not quite aware of or appreciative of at the time. We're just living our life, moving forward, traveling, taking care of our kids and our flocks and all that. And in the meantime, God's blessing us in many ways that we're not maybe quite as aware of as we should.
I was thinking of that we do just kind of trudge along day by day. And in the moment, we're not always perhaps thinking of, life's blessings. It's only when we stop and reflect. For instance, your 50th in the ministry, my 50th, being married. we stop and reflect over the course of that segment of time. And that's what Moses did with the children of Israel. He takes them back, as it were, mentally, and how God took care of them every step of the way. Sometimes we need to stop and think about where we've been in order to appreciate where we are and where God is going to take us. We have to trust that history in order to move forward with that confidence.
That's part of the reason why all through the book of Psalms, every once in a while, there's a selah.
Yes.
Stop and meditate. Stop and think about it.
Yeah.
And I've tried to get into the practice in recent years when I read through the Psalms to make sure I say that word selah, and even times I'll pause for a moment. Because God is, again, not just what he's saying in the Psalms, but he's also teaching us that every once in a while, just stop and meditate and think about what you just read. Paul tells Timothy to meditate on these things, and all through the Bible we're told to meditate and to pay attention to what God is saying and think about it, to be introspective, to be self-examining, to spend time alone with God. I call time alone with God the most needful and the most neglected part of our Christian life, is to be alone with God. How often did Jesus get up before daylight and go spend time alone with his Father in prayer and meditation and communion? And I really think, and it's convicting me even saying it because I don't do it often enough, that's how God deepens us, is through times of meditation and thoughtfulness, and just dwelling on him and his goodness. As pastors, we're so busy preparing the next sermon, the next lesson. For me, studying for these sessions, studying to put together documents to send out to people to consider. And so, I wake up every morning, and first thing I think about is, what day is it? Because then that tells me what is the first priority of study to get ready for Wednesday night lesson, or Tuesday night end time study, or Wednesday session with you, or Sunday sermon, special meeting coming up. And so I have at the bottom of my laptop, I have at any time from, 10 to 15 to 20 at different times, and that gets too many, documents opened up at the bottom. And sometimes I'll just, if I don't have something pressing for that particular day, or after I've gotten through with what I need to get ready for that particular day, I'll go down and just start opening up those different documents. And they'll be on different studies, maybe future sermons, maybe lessons, or just subjects I'm studying for no particular reason, just because it interests me at the moment. And I'll bring it up and I'll read it over, and I'll maybe add a scripture or two, a line or two, and then I'll close it back out at the bottom. And sometimes those documents will sit there for weeks or months at a time, before I finish it. But there's always something there calling my name to develop further. And my point in this is, because of that, a lot of times alone time in meditation, and not even including prayer, but beyond prayer, just meditation. Because I see all these documents sitting there saying, open me up, work on me. And it's important for a pastor, especially, because you're called on to be a spiritual example to the flock, and to give wise advice and all of that. And a lot of that does not come through study, or not only through prayer, but through quiet meditation, and letting God speak to you in the quietness of his still small voice. And I encourage anyone who watches or listens to this session to consider time alone with God as vital
Mm-hmm.
to your spiritual development.
You know, you mentioned the word selah.
Mm-hmm.
It made me think of there's at some point a pastor, whether a pastor or a cow, has to stop grazing and stop and chew the cud. And so that selah is that meditation. Just stop grazing and just stand there and just chew that cud, meditate on what you already have, you know. And so we could say selah is a spiritual chewing of the cud.
I've never heard it described quite that way before. But as usual, your visual way of describing something draws a picture that makes it stick. I'm going to regurgitate this cut and chew on it my third stomach.
Yes.
But you know, you're like this too. All of us are this way, that you're studying, and you're not quite getting it. But then when you kind of put it away, you're driving down the street, and even sometimes without noticing it, you're still meditating on it. And all of a sudden it just opens up and comes together in your mind, and you're not even at your desk or with open Bible or anything. It's just God uses that time of reflection to open up to your thinking things that do not open up to you when you're just trying to force it, you know, through got to look up this Greek word, got to run this cross reference, got to put these verses together.
Yeah.
And the, you know, the mechanics of it all. Sometimes if you're so involved in the mechanics of it, you're kind of shoving the Holy Spirit out.
Yeah.
Speaking to your heart.
Yeah.
So. And
when those thoughts roll in, that's about the time I reach for a notepad. I got to capture that thought or it's gone.
But my problem is I don't allow myself to wake up enough in the middle of the night to write it down, because if I do that, I'll be awake for a while.
You'll be awake.
But boy, the clearest thoughts come to you in the middle of the night, and they're so clear at the time that you think there's no way I'm going to lose this tomorrow when I get up and go in my office. But then you do. Sometimes you lose it.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of my best messages were preached in my sleep.
And no one ever heard it.
No one ever heard it.
After that. So I didn't read the whole passage in Numbers 10, 11 through 13. Now it came to pass on the 20th day of the second month in the second year that the cloud was taken up from above the tabernacle of the testimony, and the children of Israel set out from the wilderness of Sinai on their journeys. Then the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. So they started out for the first time, according to the command of the Lord by the hand of Moses. So they're on their way. And it doesn't take long till we get to that fateful chapter 13 and 14 of the 12 spies. And we'll get to that in just a moment, I guess. In chapter 3, we're given the sons of Aaron, the first 4 verses. And of course, 2 of them had died, Nadab and Abihu. So they only left Eleazar and Ithamar. And then, of course, the sons of Levi, the division of their labors. But I notice in chapter 3, verse 5, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Bring the tribe of Levi near, present them before Aaron the priest, that they may serve him." So the job of the tribe of Levi was to serve the priesthood. We call Levi the Levitical priesthood tribe, but to be a little bit more detailed or accurate, they were to assist the priests and to do the job of the tabernacle and the sacrifices and so forth, help them. But this verse 7 is interesting. and they shall attend to his needs and the needs of the whole congregation. So they had a double duty, kind of. One directly to the Aaronic priests, and then the other to the people. So in some sense, this lays down the groundwork or the principle brought over into the New Testament of the office of deacon, because a deacon does also a double duty. There's a responsibility to the pastor to assist him, and a responsibility to the church to assist them. So two hands, each one reaching out kind of in opposite directions to help the pastor and to help the congregation. And the Levites were kind of that in the Old Testament. But I have in my Bible circled, for instance, in verse 7, the word attend and the word work of the tabernacle. Then verse 8, they shall attend to the needs to do the work. And those words that I have circled are the same words in Genesis 2:15, where God told Adam to tend and keep the Garden of Eden. So we keep having this recurring theme of Eden and the garden and the responsibility of humans to tend and keep it, brought over into the priesthood, the Levites, and the tabernacle, because the tabernacle clearly is a picture of Eden. I think we talked about this before, the three compartments of the tabernacle being the three areas of the original creation, down to the Garden of Eden being the Holy of Holies. And God's in this laying out the offices of the Levites and the priests, of the role of the tabernacle and the tribes and the people, Moses. God is trying to get us back to Eden in fellowship and obedience and proper service. All of those things that he started out with that got messed up when sin entered, he's trying to bring those back to the forefront in this section of chapter 3 of Numbers. It says in verse 9, you shall give the Levites to Aaron and his sons. They are given entirely to him from among the children of Israel. Then in verse 12, I myself have taken the Levites from among the children of Israel instead of, that's a really important point to make there, instead of every firstborn who opens the womb among the children of Israel. God had saved the firstborn in the Passover death angel. And so the firstborn plays a large role in Bible teaching. The church of the firstborn is going to be mentioned in the book of Hebrews, firstborn ones. So the responsibility of the firstborn to carry on the commands of the father, to make sure the rest of the family follows those instructions. Because of that, they're given a double portion of inheritance. They're given rulership positions. All of these are carried over into the church and into the millennium. All of this is carried over into that. But in this case, the Levites were chosen to assist the priest instead of the firstborn, because, of course, it was the tribe of Levi who stepped forward at the golden calf incident and carried out the judgment of God, killed, I think we said in an earlier session, 3,000. So it's kind of like God restored those on the day of Pentecost. Not sure how that connection is made, but there's a connection there. Of God kind of like restoring that which he judged. And so the tribe of Levi, because of their obedience, their allegiance, their loyalty, they were given this position. And it says, therefore the Levites shall be mine, because all the firstborn are mine. On the day that I struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I sanctified to myself all the firstborn in Israel. So this opens up a real interesting part of the book of Numbers, as he goes on in this same chapter, and part of this census is he comes up with the number of Levites, and he comes up with the number of firstborn.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll find in these verses that there were 22,273 firstborn. That's in verse 43. And then there were 22,000 even of Levites. That's in verse 39. So that means there were 273 extra firstborn more than Levites. So in verse 46, he says, and for the redemption of the 273 of the firstborn of the children of Israel, who are more than the number of Levites. And then he goes on to tell what to do for the redemption of that number difference. And it's so interesting. It's just one of those great examples of every once in a while, we're always looking at the large picture, always looking at the sweeping big picture, the long range picture and everything. But every once in a while, God says, I'm also in the details.
Mm-hmm.
So even, there's 273 difference between the firstborn and the Levites. Okay, that's no big deal. It's real close. Just
Mm-hmm.
let it go.
Mm-hmm.
No, God says there's 273, and I'm going to give a means of redemption for those so that it's all taken care of. And I just like this kind of thing in the Bible where sometimes God says it's time to stop and dot the I and cross the T.
Mm-hmm.
It's time to look at the jot and tittle of the thing.
Yeah.
But other times you're looking at the larger picture. And you and I like to do both. As I like to say, sometimes it's good to look at the Bible from a telescope.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's good to look at the Bible from a microscope.
Yes.
Because both are there and both are important.
I think this set a precedent because God was retiring those 273 from their jobs in that position. And so he gave them an early buyout. So they had to be redeemed to buy them out of that position.
Early retirement package.
Yes.
Severance package.
Right.
Never quite looked at it that way, but in modern terms, that's a good way to look at it.
Yes.
Oh, Mike, you have such a unique way of taking many, many words that I speak and in one little pictorial way, summarizing it. I like that.
The yin and the yang, brother. That's who we are.
Or the Abbott and Costello, the Laurel and Hardy.
Yes.
So in chapter 4, then he starts breaking down the sons of Levi, the three sons of Levi, of Kohath and Gershon and Merari. Maybe you'd pronounce those a little different than me. But Aaron was from Kohath. And so each of these three and their families are given divisions of labor, divisions of responsibility regarding the tabernacle, taking care of different parts of the tabernacle. Division of labor then is also brought into the New Testament. Mm-hmm. So we have pastors and deacons. Mm-hmm. We have chapter 12 of 1 Corinthians goes into it in great detail. There are differences of callings, offices, gifts, but the same body.
Yes.
So even though we have different roles, different responsibilities to carry out, the overall goal is for the unity of the whole. And that's what God is doing here. He's saying that I'm going to give each of these groups important responsibilities, but it's for the purpose of a cohesive unit among the whole nation.
Mm-hmm.
So that one's not necessarily more important than the other, but all of them working together can get the job done.
They rotated these courses, these 24 courses. And so when your course as a priest, as a Levite, were not up to serve directly in the tabernacle, then you were out among the congregation teaching. You were teaching the law. And then when you were called up to the tabernacle, you were serving, you were actually applying the law. And so you mentioned deacons. I think also pastors, you teach, but then you also have to apply it. And that's what Paul was saying, that he not only, it was not only laid on him to teach it, but also then to put it into practice and to to model it for others that he was trying to reach.
In chapter 8 of Numbers, he kind of reiterates this, but maybe read it just for clarification. 8:16 about the Levites. For they are wholly given to me from among the children of Israel. I have taken them for myself instead of all who open the womb, the firstborn of all the children of Israel. For all the firstborn among the children of Israel are mine, both man and beast. On the day that I struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I sanctified them to myself. I have taken the Levites instead of all the firstborn of the children of Israel. And of course, in a large sense, God was extending the idea of the firstborn, not just to the Levites, but to the whole nation. Because God told Moses in the beginning, go tell Pharaoh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So the whole nation was to act as if they were firstborn. The responsibility of it, the loyalty of it, the carrying out of God's will of it was not restricted to the firstborn, not restricted to the Levites, not restricted to Aaron and the priests, but was to be he wanted a holy nation, not just a holy firstborn within the nation, but a holy firstborn nation.
Right.
And of course, they never lived up to that, but that was his desire, and that's why that's why Hebrews calls the church of the firstborn ones, is that everyone in the church is to see themselves as responsible before God to carry out his will, as the principle of the firstborn in the Old Testament.
Jesus Christ himself leading the way on that vein, himself being the firstborn.
Good point. In chapter 9, he gives real interesting opportunity or allowance, I guess we should say, in his mercy, of times when people can still keep the Passover in the second month, not just the first month, if there was a reason why they couldn't keep it in the first month, due to uncleanness, mostly the laws of uncleanness, and sometimes you had to be apart for days or weeks at a time, and so you couldn't observe the Passover with your family or people around you. So he allowed them. In verse 10, he says, speak to the children of Israel, saying, if any one of you, your posterity, is unclean because of a dead body or is far away on a journey, he may still keep the Lord's Passover on the 14th day of the second month. They may keep it. So there's just these kind of things through the Bible, because sometimes people say the God of the Old Testament was so strict and mean and judgmental and harsh. You see scattered all the way through that, he says about himself, I am a merciful God.
Right.
I am a tender-hearted God. I extend a lot of long-suffering. And these are examples of all of that. Now, down in verse 15 of chapter 9, he's talking about the cloud by day and fire by night. And I have underlined a bunch of words. For instance, in verse 16, always, so it was always. Verse 17, the place where the cloud settled. And verse 18, as long as the cloud stayed. Verse 21, when the cloud remained. In verse 22, the cloud remained. So those are some of the words I have underlined that is the basis for that famous word we like to use, Shekinah. The Shekinah glory of the Lord. And a lot of times when we use that phrase, the Shekinah glory of the Lord, people think that it's talking about the glory. But that's only partial idea. The real idea of it is that it's the idea of permanence, that it remains, that he's not here then there. He's with them every step of the way. He's there to go before them. But he's also, when they camp, he settles there with them in their midst.
Well, we see that picked up real strongly in the New Testament, where the Spirit would abide with them.
Yeah, so that's brought over in the New Testament with the idea of dwell and
Yes.
abide, house of God. I mean, it's just really this tabernacle, and then especially later the temple are called the house of God.
Yeah.
Because God dwells there, God abides there, God's presence is manifest there. And so once again, it's so important to see these recurring themes brought over into the New Testament. New Testament was not written in a vacuum. It was written with a deep, deep connection to the foundations laid in the Old Testament. We see in chapter 11 a common occurrence that is so totally untrue of God's people today. It was only true of Israel. God's people today are never guilty of this.
Never.
Chapter 11, verse 1.
I don't know what you're going to say, but never.
Now, when the people complained, it displeased the Lord. We never complained.
Never, ever.
And so they, of course, God was angry with them. And one thing we have as a recurring theme through Numbers, the book of Numbers, is verse 2 of chapter 11 of the intercessory work of Moses. So this is where we really have this beautiful tie to Christ, where these time and time again, these people complain, God gets angry, sometimes he's going to kill them, sometimes just kill some of them, sometimes bring a plague or different things. And Moses steps in. And the thing is, Moses agrees with God because Moses is upset with him a good part of the time too.
Yeah.
But Moses puts on his intercessor clothes and begs God for forgiveness, and God does forgive. Sometimes the judgment is still there, but not as harsh as it would have been, and things like that. So all through the book of Numbers, we see a recurring theme of Moses as intercessor. And what a beautiful picture of Christ as our intercessor, our advocate, as First John calls him, which basically is the same as paraclete, our helper, our comforter, the old King James calls it, but it's more than a comforter. It's much more. It's someone who helps us in every way. And so Moses interceded, and it says the fire was quenched because the Lord was ready to burn them all up. Now, and then there's a mixed multitude that was with them in verse 4. I don't know if you've done much study on the mixed multitude. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I was reading somewhere, I'm trying to think, I think it was Walid Shubat that, I'm just trying to recall some of the things he said, but somehow this is connected to Arabs. I'll have to go back and read what he said. He's an Arab himself, former terrorist, wrote the book, Why I Left Jihad. And so I remember him pointing that out, that I think this mixed multitude, he had a couple of other verses too, that in his mind anyway, led to believe that there were some Arabs. I'll have to go back and check that out.
Well, we do have right way back in the beginning when they were leaving Egypt in Exodus 12:38. It says a mixed multitude went up with them also. But we're not given details there. Now we have a little bit of evidence in Leviticus 24:10. Now the son of an Israelite woman whose father was an Egyptian. So evidently, this mixed multitude, some of them may have been full-blood Arabs or Egyptians. Now remember when during the time of Joseph, all the nations of that part of the world came to Egypt for bread, for grain.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them probably stayed, intermarried. And then some of them probably intermarried with the Jews who've been there for 400 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so here's one example of mixed multitude, may have been mixed blood.
Yeah.
Jew and Egyptian. Now, the son of an Israelite woman whose father was an Egyptian went out among the children of Israel. And this Israelite woman's son and a man of Israel fought each other in the camp. Kind of like the earlier story with Moses.
Mm-hmm.
And the Israelite's woman's son blasphemed the name of the Lord and cursed. So they brought him to Moses, put him in custody in verse 12, that the mind of the Lord might be shown to them. And the Lord told him in verse 14, take outside the camp him who is cursed, and let all who heard him lay their hands on his head, and let all the congregation stone him. They killed him. So this mixed multitude seemed to have been, the Jews were not totally guiltless, but they seemed to have been the cause of some of the complaint.
Mm-hmm.
And then the rest of them kind of caught on as a result. But here in 11:4 of Numbers, the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, will you give us meat to eat?
Mm.
And so that's when God gave them the quails. And it says, but I really like verse 20, God says to Moses, you shall eat, verse 19, not 1 day, not 2 days, not 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils, becomes loathsome to you. So God made them eat what they requested until they threw it up.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't stand it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
There's a verse in, I think, Psalm 105, God gave them their request, but sent leanness into their soul.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that Psalm 78 or Psalm 105? One of those chapters that talks about Israel's journey in the wilderness in the book of Psalms. This manna that he had given them, it says, I've got to say this, though, a little bit of humor. In verse 5 of Numbers 11, we remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. And I grew up under Richard Harless, and he would refer to that verse and say, can you imagine how bad their breath stunk? Onions and garlics and cucumbers.
Onions and garlic, yes.
And he said in verse 6, now our whole being is dried up. There is nothing at all except this manna before our eyes. Boy, what a great descriptive way of us, of how God gives us all we need, and yet we're not satisfied with what God has given us.
Mm-hmm.
We want more, we want different.
Mm-hmm.
And I've often said, I don't know, it's not told, but the fact that his plan was to give them manna for all this time, I think probably in manna was every vitamin and mineral and nutrient, perfect mixture of carbs and protein and fat. It was probably the healthiest diet that anyone has ever eaten in that little wafer.
Mm-hmm.
Never been duplicated because we don't know exactly how God put it together, but it satisfied their hunger and their health, mental, physical, during the whole time. It was an amazing, it was the Bible calls it angel's food.
Yeah.
Food from heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to know what all was in it, but it was totally sufficient for their dietary needs, and yet they were not satisfied.
If you want that kind of food in that concentrated form today, you're going to pay $100 a month. This was free. This came down from heaven free every morning.
I do like verse 7. At least we're given a little bit of a clue as to maybe how it tasted. Now the manna was like coriander seed, which is cilantro.
Yeah, cilantro.
Today, coriander. And so one way to describe manna is it was like tortilla chips.
Yes. Yes. What's wrong with that?
But then the next verse says its taste was like the taste of pastry prepared with oil. And another place said it had taste of honey to it. So it had a little bit of sweetness to it. It had a little bit of maybe salty, savory taste to it. It had a crunch to it. It was pleasant to the eyes and pleasant to the taste, the Bible says. I think it satisfied all of the areas of our taste buds.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was the perfect food.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what the Lord's trying to say, is that there's absolutely nothing lacking in what he provided for them in the manna, and yet it wasn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
We want more.
Mm-hmm.
I like this next part of chapter 11, the 70 elders. The Lord had said to Moses in verse 16, gather to me 70 men. And he said in verse 17, I will take of the spirit that is upon you and put the same upon them. So this is the foundation for what later became the Sanhedrin, 70 elders. So again, one of these principles laid down in the Old Testament is brought over into the New. And the two men in verse 26 didn't show up with the other group, Eldad and Medad, and the Spirit rested upon them separately. So this young man runs and tells Moses, and Joshua joined in and said, Moses, my Lord, forbid them, verse 28. And I love what Moses said here, because this is what we wish for every church member. Verse 28, Moses said to him, are you zealous for my sake? Oh, that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his spirit upon them. So we don't want to limit who the Spirit can use for blessing on others and leadership and example and all of that. We want it to expand. We want it to be as many as possible, not as few as possible. And so a true pastor does not want to be the center of focus and attention all the time. He wants others to develop, to use the gift of the Spirit in their life to minister to God's people.
Well, getting back to the 70, right?
Yeah.
Getting back to the 70, excuse me, made me think of the 70 that Jesus sent out, and then they had that same spirit of the same power. If you're going to train someone, that they have to get into the pool and swim, and so, yeah, I'm pretty sure Jesus was very pleased with their excitement to go out. And of course, they came back just reporting how wonderful it was. Or maybe I'm confusing that with the 12, but nonetheless, he was training them just as Moses was training these also. Very important to pass that on. The pastor can't do it all himself. He just can't.
No, and he shouldn't. He shouldn't want to, and he shouldn't have to.
Right.
There should be others who are spirit-filled, spirit-led people who are speaking on behalf of the Lord to God's people. We love it, don't we, to see young men develop and give devotionals and take hold and then become teachers and become preachers and deacons and so forth. You and I have been around long enough. We've seen that over the course of one or two generations develop within families. That's a great blessing.
Yes, it is.
It is.
Yes, it is.
We this last Sunday after the celebration of my 50th. Noah Ward, his wife Sierra, stayed over. They came for the service, and we had him give a devotional. And I told the church, I squatted down and reached down about a couple feet off the ground. I said, I remember when he was that tall, sitting on the front seat of the Missoula church, and he paid attention even then.
Yeah.
He did, didn't he?
Yes, he did. Yes.
So, we see it, and it keeps us going. It keeps us old guys going to see younger guys taking hold like that.
Yes, absolutely.
Then in chapter 12, Miriam and Moses kind of got off track, and they complained about verse 2. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? So it's interesting, this comes right after the 70 and the Spirit had settled on them. And there's a connection there somehow that maybe we've never made before, is that they're seeing this group of 70 become really important helpers to Moses, and they felt maybe left out. Maybe there's something about that Spirit resting on those 70 that triggered this in Aaron and Miriam, that I never quite made that connection before.
I wonder if it boils down to just your typical sibling rivalry. And it shouldn't have, because you see Aaron's role in all of this, Miriam leading the women in a celebration song. And so they really had their place and their prominence. But sometimes the flesh gets a hold, and you want more.
Well, he was the youngest of the three.
Yeah.
So, Miriam had rescued him. Mm-hmm. So she may have reminded him of that. You'd be dead without me. Aaron was older, middle child. Aaron could remind him, you couldn't even speak. I had to be the one to speak for you in front of Pharaoh.
Yes. So,
he's baby brother.
Yeah.
And
a prophet is not without honor, except of those in his own household.
There is something about the birth order that kind of stays with the siblings throughout life.
Uh-huh.
Some of that was carried over here.
Uh-huh.
And so they were kind of jealous, and they wanted more responsibility. And God showed in a very dramatic way that you need to know your place. You have an important place, but it's not the place of Moses. So you need to settle down and get your thinking straight. And so he causes Miriam to have leprosy.
Have you ever asked yourself why Miriam took the brunt of this minor coup between her and Aaron? And Aaron, he forms a golden calf.
Yeah, it's almost like he's more guilty than she is, huh?
Yeah, I'm wondering if she instigated this. I have no idea who approached who on it. But
evidently she was the oldest of the three.
Uh-huh.
So maybe she took the lead in this. Maybe she's the one who planted the idea to Aaron, and maybe she was able to convince Aaron, ever since that golden calf incident, Moses you've been overlooked. Moses isn't using you like he once did or something.
Mm-hmm.
Like you say, sibling rivalries, it doesn't take much sometimes to push the right button.
Mm-hmm. I have in my archives, from a Jewish perspective, this Jewish writer was noting the fact that out of respect for Miriam, even though she pushed against Moses' leadership, that out of respect, the camp waited for her leprosy to recover, so they could move forward again as a community, as one people. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah. And then that's what it says here, that she was shut out of the camp 7 days. People did not journey on until Miriam was brought in again. Afterwards, they moved on.
Mm-hmm.
So, you have judgment, but you have mercy mixed in too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's important to point out.
Mm-hmm.
Then we get into the famous 12 spies. And the interesting thing about this to me is that chapter 13, verse 2, that each one of these represented one of the 12 tribes. And it says at the end of verse 2, everyone a leader among them. So everyone, so we're into a portion of this story. Again, I've never thought of it quite this way. That's focusing on leadership groups, the 70, Aaron and Miriam, now these 12. So God's, for some reason, is wanting to zero in on leadership positions and leadership groups and how they're supposed to respond in faith and courage and humility and obedience. There's 3 chapters in a row, or 2 chapters in a row, 11, 12, and now 13, of leadership groups and how they're responding to their responsibilities. And of course, Joshua was verse 8, chapter 13 was from the tribe of Ephraim, and Caleb was from the tribe of Judah, which is significant because Ephraim is kind of the rival, you might say, the son of Joseph, who received the double blessing. And there was kind of a rivalry all the way through between Ephraim and Judah for prominence. So actual rivalry, actual clashes from time to time, and yet shown by Joshua and Caleb representing those 2 tribes that there was some conflict between. But these 2 showed how those 2 tribes should operate in unity as a team together, not in conflict with each other, because these were the only 2 who brought back the good report. And these are the 2 tribes of birthright promise. Judah got the kingship portion, but Ephraim got the firstborn role that Joseph had. Mm-hmm. And these are the 2 who brought back the good report. And we know the story. No use really going into detail about the story. Although I do like to point out when I deal with this story that it was not Joshua taking the lead in rebuttal of the 10 spies who brought back the bad report. It was Caleb. Caleb. So, Caleb's sometimes overlooked because Joshua's kind of the more prominent one. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But Caleb was every bit as great a man of God, a man of courage and faith as Joshua was. And the only difference is kind of like going back to the Garden of Eden. One word, when the serpent said, as God said, and Eve said, we may eat of every tree except the one. And the serpent said, he just said, God has not said. The idea that you just change a one word to make all the difference. And the difference here is that Caleb said in verse 30, we are well able. And the other 10 said, we are not able. So just to change a one word makes all the difference in the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned a minute ago about the tension between Ephraim and Judah. And it made me think of what you said in an earlier session about the overall theme of election. And I don't know if it was on Ephraim's mind or not, maybe unconsciously, but Judah, according to Jacob's blessing, was going to hold the governing position overall. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if there was this, the fact that he was elected or chosen for that position, if that just created this tension or this underlying friction, because he held, like you said, a firstborn, but then Judah was going to be the lawgiver. So, and that by God's choice.
It is something about our human nature, isn't it? Like with the manna, it's not what we have, it's what we don't have that becomes the most important.
Mm-hmm.
And our lust and desire to have what is not ours, even though what we have is a lot,
Mm-hmm.
but we cast our eye on that which somebody else has that we don't have.
Yes.
That's why the Bible so often talks about, beware of that kind of lust and desire to have what others have, jealousy and strife as a result of it. But it is interesting that the reason that the 10 spies used for not wanting to go ahead and go into the land is chapter 14 and verse 3, that our wives and children should become victims. So they, as I like to say, most conflict and problems between pastors and churches are carnal things or personality conflicts, but then you got to dress it up in religious clothes. And so this usually then some doctrine is grabbed hold of, and this is the real reason for our conflict, when it's not that at all, but you got to make it look righteous,
Yes. Yeah.
And this is what they were doing. Their lack of faith, their fear, lack of courage, trust in the Lord, they had to, you can't admit that. So you say, well, we can't go in because we're afraid for our wives and our kids. We're being responsible fathers and husbands. We don't want them to be harmed. And yet that's the very ones who went in and conquered it later with Joshua, was their wives and kids.
Yes.
Killed all those men.
Yes.
So God made sure to let them know that reason was not the real reason. And Joshua and Caleb did their best to convince the people, but they chose to believe the 10 spies, even though God had given them many victories on their journey over different nations and kings and armies, and God gave them the victory. But again, they didn't learn from that. They thought, well, okay, that's the past, but now we're going to be slaughtered if we try to go and take the land. And so they had to wander around for 38 more years. And God says in verse 31, but your little ones, whom you said would be victims, I will bring in, and they shall know the land which you have despised. But as for you, your carcasses shall fall in the wilderness. So the reason they gave, God says ahead of time, I'm going to take that reason away because it's your kids that are actually going to go in and take the land. And we like verse 24, but my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him, has followed me fully. I'll let him go in. So Joshua and Caleb, quite a bit older than anyone else once they went into the land. But I like that description of Caleb. It's a different spirit. Of course, Caleb being the ancestor of Jesus. So this is really a great picture of Jesus, of Christ himself. He has a different spirit, has followed me fully. So there's going to be one born from Caleb's bloodline eventually, that even more than Caleb, even greater than Caleb, is going to have a different spirit in him and follow me fully. And because of that, he's going to give Christ Jesus the land as an inheritance. So, of course, when Caleb later said, give me this mountain, he was 80 years old.
Yeah.
A great man of courage. What else do you want to bring out from the book of Numbers, Mike? Anything?
Well, just kind of play off of what you've just been saying. This shows again what we pastors try to emphasize with our congregations is, look, just because you're a member of the covenant community, a New Testament church, so they were members of that covenant community, and they didn't take advantage of that and go on by faith. And so probably the majority, or at least the adults, didn't make it. And so whether you're part of that community or not, it's up to you as an individual to exercise that faith. And so their carcasses were to be, food for the birds, but their children were to go on in. And so we pastor a church, an ecclesia of people, but our emphasis is, look, you're not going to get in just because you're a church member. You have to apply this faith yourself individually, just as they did. So I think it's interesting, too, that it wasn't a committee of one or two from a couple of selected tribes. You go on in, you two spies, you spied out. Everyone was to have a hand in their in the decision, as a group. So we go in as a group, or we remain out as a group, and then God would separate it out later.
Yeah, that is because a group tried to go in after that, huh?
Yes.
When God said, I'm going to make you wander around, I'm not going to let you go in because of your lack of faith. And a group of them decided, okay, we're going to go in. In verse 44, chapter 14, they presumed to go up to the mountaintop. Is that the old King James says in verse 44?
Old King James says, but they presumed to go up unto the hilltop. Yes.
There is it's much larger than we think. The sin of presumption, of presuming in our own strength and our own wisdom that we can do God's bidding. The sin of presumption is really the sin of pride, which is the core sin of all sins. So they presume to go up to the mountaintop, and then you spiritualize that.
Yeah.
They presume to go up to the mountaintop. There's a lot can be said about that spiritually. Nevertheless, neither the ark of the covenant of the Lord nor Moses departed from the camp. Moses said, I want nothing to do with it. Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who dwelt in that mountain came down and attacked them and drove them back as far as Hormah. So they tried in their own strength and they got whipped.
Yeah.
Because God said, you've already made up your mind. You chose the wrong thing, and you're going to now pay the price. They did. So I don't know, sometimes I play this game in my own mind. What might have been, what would have happened if all 12 spies came back with a good report and God would have taken them in then? Would that have meant Moses could have gone in instead of not going in later? I know it's kind of dangerous to play that game. Others would maybe take a more hardline approach on this and say, no, God's plan all along was to keep them out there for 40 years. But that's a hard case to make, because it seems like God was genuinely angry with them for not being willing to go in right then. So I think he wanted them to go in.
I think he just known his works from the beginning to the end. So he's got the answer, the next step already lined up, but he plays off of their decision. So they have to make the decision in real time before he moves on with the next phase. He's not making it up as he goes. He knows what that next phase is, but he's waiting for them to make a legitimate, genuine human decision. If it's a good decision, we go forward. If it's not a good decision, he already has the next step in mind.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that would make a good message. The sin of presumption.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot more to that than what we just brought out. The sin of presumption, because it's the sin of pride.
Yeah.
It's presuming to act on God's behalf in my own strength and wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings disaster every time. The sin of presumption.
You know, he could have given them a victory over these huge giants. He could have given a victory over those people that were really tall. They were grasshoppers in their sight. Instead, he gave them a defeat on the little people. Really humiliated them by being whipped by lesser people rather than be victorious over a greater people. How humiliating was that?
So after these people came down from the mountains and ran them off, then in their minds, how could we possibly ever think about defeating a huge, powerful, walled city like Jericho?
Mm-hmm.
And that was some of the reasons of the 10 spies. They have big walls around their city, lots of armies. And yeah, it is a land flowing with milk and honey, but there's lots of giants.
Yes.
And there's really good sermon thoughts about facing the giants in our life. And we make them bigger than they need to be, because by faith in God, those giants can be brought down and defeated.
Yep.
But we just see them as giants, impossible to overcome.
Mm-hmm.
There might be a few more thoughts next session as we think about Deuteronomy, but I'm seeing a few more things in Numbers that I may want to develop a little bit.
You know, I'd like to develop, Brother Rick, is the Aaronic blessing. I've got some.
You sent me a document, didn't you?
Yes. Maybe we could, for our viewers, maybe we could cover that ground before we move on to Numbers. To Deuteronomy.
Yeah, I have some thoughts to add to that of myself about the later development of that bloodline and how God worked in it, even through the time of David and afterwards.
Okay.
That division that you mentioned of the 24 courses, David kind of developed further. I think there's a lot there. So yeah, I'd like to deal with that. And I'd like to deal a little bit with that famous prophecy in 24:17 by Balaam, the prophecy about Christ. That's quite important. So we'll do that. We may get into Deuteronomy some next time. We just may not. We may develop these couple of different ideas and use this as a whole session. But we got through much of Numbers in session 80. And hope that something we said along the line was a blessing to you as you watch this. But we're just, as you can tell, we're not highly organized. We're wanting to come across as partly thinking out loud. We're not totally thinking out loud, because that's dangerous, but partly so that it seems a little bit more spontaneous and less planned in every detail.
Well, I hope that at the end of each session, our viewers will consider that truth was told.
That's our goal every session.
That's our goal, yes.
Hey, thanks, Mike, and look forward to our next session together.
Yes.
Bless every one of you that watch this.
Yes.
Feel free to email us and contact us and remark and suggestions even. And we're still wanting to do interviews.
Yes.
And so we're making a list, and some of you we're going to be contacting, asking you to let us do an interview with you. But if you'd like to volunteer, we'll try to be as easy on you as possible. We'd like to know about your life and ministry and some of your ideas on scriptures. And so here's your chance. Contact us and we'll figure out a way to fit you in.
Yes. And if you get a postcard in the mail, you know that you're on our list.
With what's that old draft notice of Uncle Sam pointing at you? Uncle
Yes.
Sam wants you.
Yeah, Uncle Sam.
Uncle Mike wants you. We may have to design a postcard like
We
that.
should. We should.
You have been drafted.
Yes.
You are inducted, whether you
You
want
are
to or not.
inducted. Yep. Yep. All
Yeah.
right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Mike.